Think back to Thanksgiving Day, 1950. Across the eastern United States, families were carving turkeys, unaware that above them, the atmosphere was assembling something never seen before. By nightfall, temperatures were collapsing, winds were screaming through mountain towns, and snow began to fall. Not in inches, but in feet. Within days, entire communities across Appalachia were buried. Roofs collapsed, rivers rose, power failed, crops froze where they stood. This wasn't just a winter storm, it was a chain reaction. Snow, ice, wind, and flood. It became one of the most consequential winter storms of the 20th century, contributing to at least 160 deaths, causing damage that would equal billions today, and permanently changing how the nation understood weather itself. This was the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950. And for those who lived through it, Thanksgiving was never the same. Subscribe and help us to reach 500 subscribers before the end of the year. I really appreciate. Thank you. The morning of November 23rd started like any other holiday. 100 million Americans east of the Mississippi woke to familiar sounds. The clatter of pans in kitchens, the crackle of radio static between stations playing holiday music, the squeal of children running through living rooms, excited about pie, about family, about the long weekend ahead. In Pittsburgh, a steelworker we'll call Thomas bundled his 3 kids into the car and drove across town to his mother's house. The roads were clear, the sky was gray but calm, nothing unusual for late November. In Cleveland, a young couple sat down to their first Thanksgiving as newlyweds. They'd borrowed china from her mother, set the table 3 times until it looked perfect, had no idea it would be days before they'd leave their apartment again. In small towns scattered across Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, church bells rang. Families bowed their heads and said grace. Store windows displayed hand-painted signs wishing everyone a blessed holiday. The air was cold, colder than most Thanksgivings anyone could remember. But cold was expected in late November. People pulled their coats tighter and didn't think much about it. What they couldn't know, what nobody could know, was what was already forming in the sky above them. Silent, invisible, building towards something that would bury their world in white. Here's something most people today don't realize about 1950. There were no weather satellites, no Doppler radar, no computer models tracking storms across the continent. When you wanted to know tomorrow's weather, you listened to the radio, and the weatherman made his best guess from scattered reports. Most of the time, he was close enough. But this time, he had no idea what was coming. And high above, the jet stream was moving at twice its normal speed. But here's what made the situation truly dangerous. A wall of high pressure had settled over Labrador like a boulder blocking a highway. Any storm that formed would have nowhere to go. No escape to the Atlantic, it would be trapped, spinning, dropping everything it carried on the same unlucky stretch of the country. The people at those Thanksgiving tables knew none of this. They couldn't. By late afternoon, as families finished their pie and settled into armchairs for football on the radio, a light rain began falling across the Midwest. Nothing alarming, just a gentle tapping on windows. Then the sun went down, and that steelworker Thomas, the one who'd driven his kids across Pittsburgh that morning, he was about to face a choice that would haunt him for years: stay put at his mother's house or try to make it home before conditions got worse. He chose to stay. It saved his life. The rain turned to snow in Chicago around 8 o'clock that evening. Within 4 hours, the temperature dropped to 0. Not just cold, the kind of cold that makes car engines refuse to start and water pipes explode in their walls. In Steubenville, Ohio, families who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner in 38-degree weather woke the next morning to 14 degrees. 24 degrees gone overnight, and the snow had just started. This wasn't the gentle snow of Christmas cards. It came sideways, horizontal, driven by winds so fierce it found every crack in every window. It buried cars in minutes. It piled against doors so quickly that by morning, some families couldn't push them open. In Pittsburgh, that steelworker Thomas watched through his mother's window as the world disappeared. His car, parked on the street below, vanished under a growing white mound. The roads he'd driven the day before no longer existed. He wouldn't see his own house again for 3 days. But Thomas was one of the lucky ones. He had shelter. He had food. He had family. Others weren't so fortunate. Robert Niels of Mundelein, Illinois, became the first recorded death of the storm. He was 26 years old. His car skidded on ice that Friday and overturned. He was trying to get home for the holiday weekend. He never made it, and Robert Niels would not be the last. Not by a long shot. Over the next 10 days, at least 160 people would die. Many from the storm itself, others from what it set in motion. Because in a storm like this, the danger wasn't one thing, it was everything. But here's what made this storm unlike anything America had experienced in modern memory. Across 1,000 miles of the country, in the mountains of central Pennsylvania, freezing rain fell for hours, coating every surface in inches of solid ice. In the valleys below, rivers swelled and burst their banks, flooding towns with no warning. Along the coast from Maryland to Maine, hurricane-force winds drove storm surges in the tens of feet into seaside communities. In New England, gusts topped 100 miles per hour. Every town in Connecticut suffered damage. 26 states, snow, ice, floods, and hurricane winds, all from the same storm system. And the people in its path had received no warning at all. Remember that young couple in Cleveland? The newlyweds with the borrowed china? By Friday afternoon, they'd watched 10,000 cars get abandoned on the streets of their city. 10,000. Every major road lined with empty vehicles disappearing under snowdrifts. The trolley system ground to a halt. Buses got wedged in drifts. One driver stopped to let passengers help push, and the bus took off without them, leaving them stranded. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, the only true freeway in America at that time, closed for the first time in its history. Over 700 people found themselves trapped in Irwin, Pennsylvania, a small town that had never expected to become a refugee camp. Hotels filled within hours. Then churches opened their doors. Then bars, then farmhouses. Strangers took in strangers because there was no other choice. And that's when something remarkable started to happen. Something that would define how people remembered this storm for the rest of their lives. Communities that had been strangers to each other on Wednesday were sharing food and blankets by Saturday. Farmers hitched up horses and sleighs, the only vehicles that could move through the drifts, and delivered groceries to neighbors who hadn't left their houses in days. In Chester, West Virginia, a man brought his team of horses into town and spent the entire weekend hauling supplies to the stranded. A milkman in the Pittsburgh suburbs abandoned his truck for a horse-drawn cart and made every stop on his route, even when it took 3 times as long. People needed milk. They needed bread. They needed to know someone was still out there. But what about Thomas, our steelworker stranded at his mother's house? He spent those 3 days helping neighbors dig out, checking on elderly folks who lived alone, sharing coal when supplies ran low. He later told his son it was the most exhausted he'd ever been in his life, and also the proudest. By Saturday, the snow reached its peak. This was the day that would set records, the day old-timers would talk about until they died. Pittsburgh recorded its heaviest snowfall ever, before or since. In Steubenville, the final total reached 44 inches, nearly 4 feet. Wheeling saw drifts that climbed to second-floor windows. The National Guard deployed Sherman tanks to Cleveland streets. Actual tanks. They were the only vehicles that could move. In Berea, Ohio, a tank towed a city bus 8 miles to its destination. The trip took 3 hours. But the machinery of rescue couldn't reach everyone. Not in time. On November 29th, 5 children were found alone in a farmhouse in Greene County, Pennsylvania. They had almost no food, no heat. Their mother had been trapped in a town 20 miles away since the storm began. She'd been trying to reach them for days. The next day in Hocking County, Ohio, rescuers found a family of 9 in a rundown house half a mile from the nearest passable road. All they had left to eat was half a jar of jam. These families had no way to call for help, no phones, no roads. They just waited and prayed someone would find them. And then there were the Fisher brothers. I need to tell you about the Fisher brothers. Johnny was 4 years old. His brother Frel was 11. They lived in Roanoke, West Virginia, a small community where everybody knew everybody, and the river ran through the center of town. On December 3rd, 10 days after the storm began, Johnny fell off a bridge into the West Fork River. The water was swollen with snowmelt, moving fast and cold and deadly. Frel didn't hesitate, not for a second. He jumped in after his little brother. Neither was ever seen again. They were the final victims of the Great Appalachian Storm, a 4-year-old who slipped, an 11-year-old who loved him too much to let him go alone. We'll come back to what their story means. But first, you need to understand just how vast this disaster was and why you probably never learned about it in school. The storm didn't just bury Appalachia in snow. In central Pennsylvania, something arguably worse was happening. Freezing rain fell for hours in the mountains around Altoona and Clearfield. Not snow, rain that froze instantly on contact with every surface. Trees, power lines, roads, houses. 1 inch of freezing rain is usually considered catastrophic. Parts of central Pennsylvania got 4 inches. The weight of ice snapped 100-year-old trees like matchsticks. Every high-voltage transmission line in the region came down. Every single one. Cities that had grown dependent on electricity suddenly had none. Altoona went dark. Clearfield went dark. Tens of thousands of people found themselves living by candlelight and gas lamp, cooking over wood stoves, melting snow for drinking water. It was like the 20th century had been erased overnight. Power company workers flooded in from across the state. There were so many they had to sleep in railroad cars and eat meals cooked by the Shriners, who served over 6,000 hot dinners in 9 days. The linemen faced impossible conditions. Every time they repaired a line, another ice-laden tree would fall and take it down again. In desperation, they tried something new. They deliberately short-circuited the wires to generate heat and melt the ice. It actually worked. But even so, parts of Altoona didn't get power back until December 14th, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. Some areas weren't fully restored until after Christmas. Meanwhile, in the valleys of central Pennsylvania, rivers were rising. Tyrone had 5 feet of water in its streets. Lock Haven went underwater. At one point, the west branch of the Susquehanna rose 14 feet in just 12 hours. Towns evacuated by rowboat. 1,000 people spent the weekend in a high school gymnasium in Tyrone, including the Penn State marching band, who'd gotten stranded on their way home from a football game. And along the coast, the storm surge was rewriting the shoreline. In New Jersey, a 25-foot wave tore a 200-foot section of boardwalk loose at Long Branch and sent it flying into a crowd of people who'd gathered to watch the storm. 2 died instantly. In Morgan Beach, 36 of 38 houses were simply washed away. Entire communities vanished. The damage estimates kept climbing. $500,000 just in Pittsburgh cleanup costs, $60,000 in Youngstown, $100,000 in Columbus. Individual totals that added up to devastation. And insurance? Most people had none that would help. Comprehensive homeowners policies had only been invented 2 months earlier. Almost nobody had them yet. If your roof collapsed from snow, but you only had fire insurance, you got nothing. When the sun finally came out and the digging began, America faced a question it hadn't seriously considered before. How had nobody seen this coming? The weathermen had looked at their data, the scattered reports from ships and weather stations, and predicted a moderate storm. They'd expected it to blow out to sea like storms usually did. They were wrong, not because they were bad at their jobs, because they simply didn't have the tools to see what was forming. No satellites, no radar, no computers, just guesswork and hope. After the storm, that had to change. In Princeton, New Jersey, 2 scientists saw an opportunity in the disaster. Jules Charney had developed mathematical equations that could theoretically predict storm behavior, but the calculations were too complex to solve by hand. What he needed was a computer. ENIAC, the first electronic computer, had been built in 1945. It filled an entire room. It could perform calculations in 30 seconds that would take humans 20 hours. Charney and his colleague John von Neumann fed the data from the Great Appalachian Storm into ENIAC. They ran their equations. They compared what the computer predicted with what had actually happened. The results matched. If they could predict this storm after the fact, they reasoned, they could predict future storms before they struck. That realization changed everything. By 1952, more powerful computers were testing weather models using this same storm as their benchmark. Every major advance in meteorological forecasting for the next several decades traced back to those calculations. Back to the lessons learned from November 1950. Today, when you check the weather on your phone, when you see a hurricane warning days in advance, When forecasters tell you to stay home before a blizzard hits, you're benefiting from work that began in the wreckage of Thanksgiving 1950. The storm forced change in other ways too. Building codes were strengthened. Emergency response systems were created. The way Americans thought about winter weather, about preparedness, about community resilience, all of it shifted. But for the people who lived through those impossible days, the changes that mattered most weren't institutional. They were personal. That steelworker Thomas, the one who'd stayed at his mother's house and helped his neighbors survive, he never forgot what those days taught him. For the rest of his life, he kept extra food in his pantry, extra blankets in his closet. He'd learned that the world could change overnight, and the only thing you could really count on was being ready to help the people around you. The newlyweds in Cleveland, they celebrated their 50th anniversary in the year 2000, and every Thanksgiving, they told the story of their first one, the borrowed china, the world turning white, the days they spent trapped in their apartment, learning things about each other they never would have discovered any other way. Their grandchildren grew up hearing that story, understanding that storms could bring people closer together. And the Fisher brothers, Johnny and Frel, their story spread through West Virginia and beyond. A 4-year-old who fell, an 11-year-old who jumped without thinking. Some people said it was tragedy, and it was, but others saw something else. A boy who loved his brother so much that nothing else mattered. Not the cold water, not the impossible odds, not the fear. In Roanoke, people still remember their names. November 1950 faded into history. The snow melted. The power came back on. The roads cleared, and life resumed its ordinary rhythm. But ask anyone who was there. They'll tell you about the sound, the howl of wind that went on for days. They'll tell you about the silence afterward, that strange quiet when the storm finally broke, and you stepped outside into a world that had been completely transformed. They'll tell you about the cold that got into your bones and didn't leave for weeks. And they'll tell you about the neighbors who showed up with shovels, the strangers who shared their last loaf of bread, the farmers who hitched up horses because trucks couldn't move, the radio announcers who stayed on air for 5 days straight so people would know they weren't alone. 75 years later, the Great Appalachian Storm has faded from public memory. It doesn't get taught in schools. It doesn't appear in the history books most Americans read. But for those who were there, and for their children, and for their children's children who grew up hearing the stories, that Thanksgiving changed everything. It taught them that the modern world was more fragile than it appeared. It showed them what ordinary people were capable of when everything else failed. And it reminded them, in a way they never forgot, that the things that matter most aren't the things you can buy or build or plan for. They're the people who show up when the world goes white. Somewhere in West Virginia, in a small town along a river that still runs cold in winter, there's a bridge. It doesn't look like much, just concrete and steel, the same as 1,000 other bridges in 1,000 other towns. But the people who live there know what happened on that bridge in December 1950. They know about Johnny and Frel. They know about the storm that buried their grandparents' world. And every now and then, when the weather turns cold and the forecasters warn of what's coming, they look out their windows at the snow beginning to fall, and they remember. If you lived through the Great Appalachian Storm, or your family did, share your story in the comments below.